Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 141, Federations Facing the Future. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And as we continue this series loosely inspired by the 5th anniversary of the study by the Pew Research Center called A Portrait of Jewish Americans, a major population study that was conducted of the Jewish community in 2013, and whose reverberations we're trying to explore 5 years later. Has anything really changed as a result of this study, which had a lot of really interesting findings that we discussed last week? How have things changed for the existing set of dominant Jewish organizations that have dominated the Jewish landscape in the 20th century and still here at the beginning of the 21st? And have other things changed in the way that people are looking at some of the major questions that the study raises? Today, our guest is the CEO of the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, the Peninsula, Marin, and Sonoma counties. We're really excited to welcome Danny Grossman here. He's the first CEO of a major Jewish federation that we've had on the show, and he is the CEO of the federation in the San Francisco Bay Area, which in many ways is on the leading edge of a lot of the changes that we are talking about in terms of the Jewish community and its future. The Federation of the San Francisco Bay Area recently conducted a population survey of its own in the area that it covers. So in some ways, we're going to be looking at the Pew study from 5 years ago and at the recent study of the Bay Area conducted just in the past year, and wondering how a federation looks at that data and tries to think about what it wants to do in the future. Danny Grossman has an unusual background for a federation CEO. Prior to taking his position as the CEO of the San Francisco Bay Area Federation, Danny was a successful entrepreneur with a couple of really cool companies that he ran, including a toy company. Prior to that, he served for 7 years in the United States Foreign Service and at the Department of State. Before he became a Jewish professional, so to speak, he served on many, many boards of Jewish organizations, both in the Bay Area and nationally, as well as serving as a board member of a variety of other kinds of organizations. Danny Grossman has an MBA from Stanford University, and he did his undergraduate work in Russia and East European studies. We're really excited to welcome him for a really interesting conversation about the world of Jewish federations, past, present, and future. Danny Grossman, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you on.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we haven't talked before to somebody who leads a major Jewish federation, or for that matter, any Jewish federation. And as an orientation for our listeners, I think it would be really helpful for you to share with us a little bit what the federation has been, what the federation's role was in the 20th century. You know, what is it that you really inherited when you became the CEO of the Federation in the San Francisco area?
So first of all, I'm really excited for the opportunity to be the first or among the first who's able to describe to you from the inside out what we do and frankly, why I stepped into this role 3 years ago from a very different career. This federation was built more than 100 years ago. And the idea was to look out across the broadest needs of the Jewish community and to ensure that our community was safe, secure, that it thrived, that we had the resources we need. And it's been very successful, so much so that success has called into question the model, because it was different when the community didn't have the many agencies that it has today and synagogues and other organizations. Today, we have to ask ourselves, what is our role in the community we've helped to create?
One time, somebody described a federation to me in a way that I found helpful, and I'm curious if this is right from your perspective, that a way to look at it is kind of like a mutual fund where people, a wide variety of people, can make modest or larger contributions, and that the federation has this kind of centralized capacity to hold that money responsibly and then to sort of have a a professional process of trying to figure out where the greatest need of that money is and where the investment is going to have the greatest return, just as a mutual fund does, which, as we all can imagine, it's really hard for an individual donor to do, just as an individual investor would struggle to know exactly which stocks to invest in. Is that a helpful framework for sort of thinking about how a federation operates?
Dan, I think that's a very helpful metaphor for a slice of how the Federation operates, and maybe an even better metaphor for thinking about why it might be attractive to a donor. Because if a donor wants to see a thriving Jewish community but can't possibly understand what the needs are at any given time, the investment in, let's call it this metaphoric Jewish mutual fund, is an investment in the Federation to determine where those needs are. The reason I say it addresses only a slice of our business is making grants is only a part, not an insignificant part, but only a part of what we do. We play a significant role in recruiting, educating, stewarding philanthropists for the community, and supporting those philanthropists and clients in their philanthropic work.
What's a little bit of your background in terms of getting to a place where you are the CEO of a major Jewish federation? What preceded that, and what led you to want to do this?
Well, I was born in San Francisco. And although I was very active in the Jewish community here, I was on the Zionist wing of the Jewish community in a Zionist youth movement called Young Judea. I went to Israel through Young Judea, lived there for a year, and really didn't have any touch points with Federation because my family did not. It wasn't until I was serving in Leningrad as a diplomat that I looked around at the community there and I thought, why is this community, this Jewish community, so fractious? And why is it have such a difficult time determining the best needs of the community and how to allocate resources toward it? And aside from the Soviet power, which is a huge part of that answer, the other part of the answer was there was no central coordinating, organizing body for the community. And when I came back, it's not like I said, what is Federation? How do I find it? But I had that question in my head. And shortly thereafter became active in some Jewish organizations and then aware of Federation. At that point, because I was running a toy company that I founded, I wasn't looking for a CEO gig, but I was very invested and involved and was on the board for much of 17 years, on and off the executive committee, performing lots of different functions. And honestly, I didn't have I for sure didn't have the chutzpah to think that I could be the CEO of a federation or even the inclination. It wasn't in my mind. But in rapid fire, the idea of being a CEO of federation was put in my mind by someone during a recruitment cycle. And shortly thereafter, I went through the Wexner Heritage Program and gained enough Jewish knowledge to augment what I already have to sort of let that chutzpah start to grow in me. And 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, when I was recruited, I thought it was exactly the place I wanted to be at this stage in my life.
So one reason that we wanted to talk to you at this time was because your federation recently did something that I think sounds like it's among those things that really only a federation, or likely only a federation, is going to do, which is to study the nature of the larger Jewish community in your area. And we've put together this series of episodes, I don't know, celebrating or marking or mourning the 5-year anniversary of the release of the Pew study, which looked at the American Jewish community as a whole 5 years ago. And there are a few things that we're trying to sort of understand a little bit about how that kind of data is used. One way that it's used is that there's some kind of big headlines that freak out everybody. In the case of the 1990 Jewish population survey, it had to do, I think, with intermarriage. And in the Pew study in 2013, it was this big number of Jews of no religion. And I'm just curious how you, doing this professionally, look at a study like the recent population survey that you did of the San Francisco Bay Area. And how do you look at that? And without the sort of alarmist headlines, how do you look at a study like that? And how do you say, as somebody who's playing this role centrally in a Jewish community, okay, this is what this data means, and this is what we ought to consider doing with it?
The community portrait, which is what we call it, We developed, exactly to your point, because really only a federation can undertake something of that scale for the broad community. We, for the first time, chose to have it consider the full 10 counties of the Bay Area. So as some of your listeners may not know, in the 10 counties of the Bay Area, there's the San Francisco-based federation, which covers most of the West Bay. There's the Silicon Valley Federation in San Jose, Los Gatos, and there's an East Bay Federation across the Bay. But what we know about this community anecdotally, and even through data in the secular world, is that there's increasing crossover among and between those counties and among and between those federation areas. So to your point about how do we approach a study like this, knowing that, having that information in our head, we wanted to have a better understanding where people are working, where they're living, where they're recreating, because that will guide some of our thinking about programming, how to engage them, where to find them. Another example relates to, maybe the most profound, relates to who our community is, or maybe more appropriately, as we say it now, who our communities are. And so we had, as far as I know, the most expansive definition going into this of who is considered part of the Jewish community. And that enabled us to, we felt, to capture the fullness of the community without having to overlay an overly tight description of who is a Jew, which, as we know, we always struggle with. In terms of the use of the data itself, in taking the data, then we've moved out across the community and convened many conversations about it. We don't presume to know precisely what the data means as opposed to what it says. And from there, we certainly rely on the collective wisdom of our community to understand what to do about it.
I would love to just get a little bit more of a sense of the Bay Area community, just to lay some groundwork, because for many people listening, they're not in the Bay Area, but I think it would be helpful to look both at, okay, so what are some really distinctive characteristics of the Bay Area Jewish community? I think what you just described in terms of having 10 counties and multiple federations is already something that's not true in all sorts of other Jewish communities around the country. But also, what are some of the pieces that do resemble many other Jewish communities around the country, just so that as we're digging into this, we can start to think, oh, these are pieces that apply all over the place and are similar. These are places that are distinctive, those kinds of framing issues.
We like to think of ourselves, like I think every community does, as quite unique. True or not, there are characteristics of this community that are different. First of all, there is no center to this Jewish community. When people come here, they're often struck by the fact that while this is the fourth largest Jewish community in the country, there is no geographic center, and people are lost. Once they find their way in, they can't understand how they ever missed it because there's so much activity going on here. But there isn't that center. The second thing about this community is we have both a very large Israeli population, Israeli-born population, and a very large Russian-speaking population. In both of those communities, each of 30,000 plus people in an overall community of 350,000. So very significant diversity at that level. We also learned from this study what, again, we started to perceive anecdotally, that Jews of color in our community, broadly defined, are very significant. The data point there is that in our 150,000 households, Jewish households, 25% of them have a person of color who's either a child, a partner, a spouse, but members of our community writ large, again, living in Jewish households, is very significant. And the implications of that in terms of our activities will be strong, because we don't see that represented in the corridors of our organizations and in our boardrooms, et cetera. In what ways are we similar? I can think mostly of the ways we're different. You know, another way we're different is we have a very small Orthodox population here. We only have 3% in our community, and so it's significantly different than others. We have a larger intergroup marriage rate than in other communities. We don't talk about that as interfaith because it's more than simply faith. There are many people not of faith in those marriages, as you appreciate. We're similar probably in trend lines, in many of the trend lines. So intergroup marriage is one of them, either though we're further down the line. Ambivalence toward Israel is one of them. And I say ambivalence is distinct from negativity or hostility toward Israel, because that's actually what we learned, is that if you can imagine a bell curve, there are many people very passionate about Israel on one end. There are some who are quite hostile toward Israel on the other. And in the middle, there are a lot of people who are trying to figure it out. They're ambivalent. They're discouraged. So I think, there are trend lines where we are very similar, and we're probably just a little further down the line. I think we know, most of us, that our vision tends to outstrip the resources that will follow it. There are some really tough decisions that need to be made, a raging debate among many of us about doubling down on investment for those that are engaged, or spending those incremental dollars on those who are not, and with all the risk factors associated. Those aren't easy conversations, but they're possible, because these aren't businesses trying to maximize their profit. We're all trying to serve the same goal.
Let's dive deeper into the point you brought up about Jews of color. Jews of color, in addition to, so there's Jews of color and people of color living among Jews, which both would fall into the category that you laid out. I love the way that you put that, by the way, of the households contain somebody who is a person of color, and in lots and lots of those situations, that person is themselves Jewish, I'm sure, and in lots of other situations, that person is not. But including both of them in that category is in and of itself a statement of inclusion that I think is important. So thank you for that. But pushing a little more just to look into that, I think it's easy. It may be easy for many listeners to hear that. What was the number again? What were the percentage of households? It was 150,000 out of 350,000?
150,000 households, and it's a quarter of those households.
Right. Sorry. Great. So let's say a quarter of these households, and I think somebody listening could be like, wow, that's much different from my community. But what we know from the national data is that it's likely not that different from many communities around the country. And as much as, like you sort of mentioned, our institutions might not reflect this yet, the Jewish community is already a community, past tense and present tense, and of course also future tense, where white skin cannot be taken for granted, where certainly European roots, Ashkenazi roots cannot be taken for granted. And so I'd love to just hear more on that point in particular. We can go into other avenues later too, but like, what does it look like to go from, okay, we have this finding now, and then to start to do that work of, okay, we want to build a community where those folks are equally represented and where those folks are included and empowered, and not only just included, but leading. What do those steps look like? Because I know you're at the beginning of that process, but it's probably a long journey ahead.
Yeah, well, listen, Lex, I appreciate your recognition of the inclusion. I was raised, as I said, in San Francisco, and my mother was, who was not Jewish, was never welcome in the synagogue, and that was always reaffirmed by those fire and brimstone sermons we heard about how intermarriage is killing Judaism. So to think about those people who are in Jewish households as being part of our community, whether they themselves choose to become Jewish or not, they are part of our community. And Janet Martyr, another pioneer of the Bay Area, Rabbi Janet Martyr was the first person to call on the non-Jewish spouses of members of their synagogue to be honored for being there for their Jewish partners and for being part of the community with them. So to your question, you're absolutely right that it's there's no quick path to address an issue like inclusion of Jews of color and their family members in our community. So one of the questions we asked in the survey was intended not at this finding, because we didn't know we'd find this, but at any finding related to inclusion, and it was, do you feel welcome in the Jewish community? And to a much higher degree than we understood, people feel welcome. What we understood from the data is they feel welcome, but they don't necessarily feel like they belong, because they don't see their people, they're not talking about their issues. Certainly in the organized Jewish community, the data shows that it's a wealthier than average group for reasons you might imagine. So that's a deeper tissue, more complicated problem. And we've thought, for example, because this trend, as you would imagine, is expanded at the younger levels of the demographics, we said, what can we do, for example, to not just encourage Jews from those communities to come to our camps or our schools, but what resources can we provide to make sure that they feel not only welcome, but like they truly belong? And that's an investment in sort of communal understanding that's not unlike what we touched on, which is related to intergroup marriage. That the decades of work we had to do to get to a place where we have the kind of conversation we're having today, as opposed to the one that we had 40 years ago. So that's the beginning of the process for us, and it's very much focused, at least right now, on a younger demographic.
I'm thinking about the responses of the Jewish world to the 1990 Jewish population survey, and then sort of trying to think from there, what might we do if we were learning from that experience in the 2000 teens? Folks might disagree about whether this is a good thing or not, but one of the findings was that there was some correlation between Jewish connection later in life and visiting Israel. And so out of that came the Birthright program, but that came not from the Federation world. That came from a number of very wealthy donors who said, we believe that this is a worthy experiment and we want to jump into this and we're going to fund it. And then later on, once it sort of was really up and running, certain federations started to offer substantial funding to that program. And I'm wondering, not in a pejorative or in a judgmental way, is that what it should be? Is it really kind of not the role of federations to kind of be the early adopters or the radical experimenters who somehow take some data like for example, the Jews of color and the people of color data that we're talking about, who might take that and say, wow, 25% of our households have a person of color in them. That should suggest that we probably don't have anything currently going on in the Jewish community which wasn't evolved in a community that looked like that it's really going to be all that great for those folks. And so we really need to have a major initiative, just like folks who did back in 1990 thought about Israel. And we really want to launch that. And let's figure out how to do that. Is that the role of a federation in a community? Is it a federation's role to fund that, to, sort of like urge the question to be taken on in a big way? Or really, is that the role, as it was after the 1990 survey, is that the role of some large foundation or some very wealthy individual who kind of has more license to, experiment radically with their money than a federation might, which sees itself as having more responsibility to the donors who gave the money who aren't involved in that decision?
Let me start by saying that the metaphor that sometimes we use about federation is it's the city hall of the Jewish community. I'm not sure I like that metaphor either, but for this purpose and responding to that question, I think it's useful because what it connotes is that we have broad responsibilities, unlike a foundation, which could choose to say, we're doing this for 5 years and then we're going to turn about completely and do something else. Both of those have their place in the community and add value, but we play a particular role. And so I think to your question, it means that we don't pivot as quick, and we shouldn't pivot as quickly as you're saying. That said, I think there is a role for federation, and I hope we're doing that, and I hope we do more of it to galvanize responses to those kinds of trends that we see. And I'm very deliberate in saying galvanize responses because it doesn't necessarily have to be our resources. I mean, we convene the Jewish Family Foundations, and together we sit and talk about the issues. We could agree, this wing of the group is going to do it and we'll be in later. But I think being part of the solution in some way, even if we're not turning all our funding in that direction, is critically important.
I was actually going to bring up the citizenship model, the city hall model that you cited, because I hear it in in conversations with folks from a variety of federations. And also beyond federations, I hear it as a general metaphor. We've talked a lot on the show about how the metaphors we utilize affect our thinking in like really deep ways. And I hear it as a metaphor of Judaism, of Jewish life very frequently, that communal institutions like the Federation play the role of something like a centralized city hall, of like government institutions. We don't have a state power through Jewish auspices in the U.S., so we create this sort of separate set of institutions that resemble it in certain ways. But I really do want to push on it, because there's a basic difference that not that I think like indicts anyone, but just that I think opens up a conversation, which is in the citizenship model, people vote. And in Jewish communal leadership generally, when we're talking about federations, when we're talking about other institutions, there aren't elections. There's not people voting. There's not a system such that the Jewish population of the Bay Area or of any area is coming together and making their voice heard on a thing, and then that thing, whatever the majority of them think, that happens. There's an argument that maybe that happens through donor dollars, and where the most dollars are can affect things. That could have some negatives, that could have some positives. That brings up all sorts of big questions. But I just would love to hear more from you when you talk about the Jewish Federation as a kind of city hall. When you sort of look out at the schema of the Bay Area's Jewish community as analogous to the way that state institutions serve the broader community. Like what does that mean, and how does that inform the work that you're doing? Without necessarily approaching only my pushback, but just really what's your metaphor there?
What I often say about the Federation is that we're the only organization that's looking after the broadest needs of the Jewish community here, let alone what we do globally for global Jewry and in Israel. But if we stay for a moment with our local area, we're the only organization that does that. And I think that's really important, because a vital community doesn't need to have every organization sustained or every service provided, but someone needs to look after it. And that's how I get to the metaphor. That's the part of the government metaphor that works for me. People say to me, well, this city foundation, X-City Foundation, is really focused on poverty. We should do that. We should really focus just on one thing. And I say, well, that foundation has the advantage that there's a government that supersedes it. And if something else is going to, fall off the cart elsewhere, it'll be taken care of, because that's in theory the social ills that government tends to address. Yes, you're right. The part that doesn't work for me is that people don't vote. So there's a question of how we have governance that's appropriate. And we thought that through to the extent that we have a vast array of people from a giving standpoint on our board, in our realms of governance, people who give $18 to people who give $1 million. And so it's not the model where the more dollars, the more votes, even though let's be honest, significant donors have influence, of course, just like they do in the halls of Congress. Part that does work for me, Lex, I don't like the term Jewish taxes, because the word taxes are sullied, but I love the idea of a Jewish communal gift. I love that. I mean, in this area, we are way ahead of the trend of Jews giving to those things that are of interest to them and which they can touch and feel. And on the one hand, I like that. And on the other hand, we may lose something, which is this idea, to think of Maimonides' hierarchy, of Jews giving to things they don't even know about that they within their community. So that's another element of it that does work for me.
Well, that actually connects to something that I'm trying to sort of process as I'm thinking about it, trying to ask you. But and I know that it could be potentially a little bit of a difficult question to answer, and so I want to sort of take my own medicine and say that I hope none of our potential funders are listening to this podcast. But because I might very well submit a grant for what I'm about to say, I wish I didn't have to do. But there are ways in which I really wish that there was another organization like Judaism Unbound, that had our same philosophy, but that was going out there and sort of organizing people to do things on the ground. Because the part that I really like and that I really think I can do best is the ideas part, is the talking to people and thinking and trying to sort of formulate concepts. And I wish that I could just do that. It's sort of similar to what you were just saying, but if there's nobody else out there doing that, then I'll do the other thing too if we have to. If the idea is to sort of make this all work. And I guess I'm saying that I would be really excited if somebody came to me and said, "Hey, we're going to create that other organization so that you don't have to, and let's partner." And I guess I'm asking you, in terms of thinking about it from your place at the Federation, like, what do you wish would be out there in the Jewish community so that you could do the things that Federation wants to do or is really good at? And I'm thinking in particular of, like, well, what if you had a mutual fund company and most of what they invested in was bonds, and you said, yeah, but I want to put a little bit of my money into the growth fund. And they said, well, we don't have a growth fund, and sometimes that's how I feel about federations, that for all sorts of historical and practical reasons, no judgment, may not have a growth fund. And one thing that we could try to do is push federations to start a growth fund. I'm going to do that until there's an alternative out there. But I'm really curious, like, how you think about that, in part also because I know that I'm going to say in other cities, sometimes federations, they want to be the central address for Judaism in that city. And as a result, sort of don't necessarily allow that growth fund to come into existence. They resist it. They don't want the sort of what they might perceive as competition. And I'm just sort of wondering how you think about the role for Federation to be, like you said, the only place who could do a population survey, and there's some importance to that and some power to that. But at the same time, if that has a result of boxing out other things, that's not necessarily good for the larger mission.
Yeah, so the first thing I should say is that the way we think about our role today in this community is more in the realm of network leadership. We don't think of it in a hierarchical way, not least because we have partners that are very significant in this community. Partners in the social service realm, among the JCCs, as you know, the Hillels are very strong. We have nationally recognized leaders and agencies, and we think we could be most effective to be networked with them as a leader. So then to your question about innovation, yeah, I think it goes with the territory that large, successful organizations, and I think the federations have been very successful over the past 100 years. If they hadn't been, the Dalai Lama probably wouldn't have summoned them out to talk about how the Jews survive in diaspora as he did. Are a struggle with innovation. I think we know that. I think we know that in the private sector too. It's not that nothing's being done, and certainly we feel, since we adjusted our model, we're increasingly investing in that. And often what we have done, and I know what other federations are doing, is they create a kind of a parallel fund to enable that to happen. So one of the purposes of our unrestricted endowment is for seed funding. We've seeded a lot of the exciting organizations that you featured on your show over the years. And honestly, I think it's not enough. I think we have to think through the continuum of the life of those organizations, because seeding is one thing, sustaining through mezzanine funding and growth is another thing. And so I think we have plenty of work to do there. We have, as we know from the survey, the largest percentage of young adults in this community of any Jewish community in the country. And to capture that significant group, who are very diverse and many of whom moved here, have no roots here, for a single organization like the Federation was nearly impossible. 30 years ago, we were the only organization. And in many Jewish communities around the country, that is still true. The Federation is where you go as a young person who wants to plug in. Happily, we now, on a monthly basis, we convene up to 25 program providers for young adults in this community to make sure that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
So you mentioned a little bit earlier that in San Francisco, as is the case in many Jewish communities all around the country, deep involvement often correlates with increased wealth. I mean, the people that are most integrally involved on the boards or even just as members in these organizations tend to be from upper middle class or upper class backgrounds. And we've named that occasionally in the past on the podcast, but we haven't done it quite as much as I think we would all benefit from doing. So given that we're talking about the Bay Area, I mean, we have a lot of particular dynamics at play that, I mean, there's articles forgetting just Jewish life. There's articles in general about everything from the class dynamics of Burning Man to the role that Google plays and that the transformations that have happened as a result of the growth of Silicon Valley on communities. So given that the class conversation is kind of heightened in this particular community that we're talking about, I'd love to hear from you. Just what does it look like I'm asking the same question I asked before about Jews of color, spoiler. But what does it look like to go from the finding, once again, of there's a lot of people involved with Jewish life and they're coming disproportionately from the communities that have the most access to wealth. What does it look like to go from that to then, okay, we're going to build the community where those who don't have as much access are going to absolutely find channels in?
It's something we've been working on already because we're aware of, to take one slice of what you're describing, we're aware of the high cost of Jewish life and Jewish participation. We are aware of that. You know, just as many things are free, like birthright, really, once you get into your family, things start to cost, and they cost a fair bit. So when I say we're already looking into that, for example, one of our largest line items in terms of the grants that we make are for scholarships to camps, to day schools, to other opportunities to engage in Jewish life. There is a phenomenon which has put that into warp speed, which you described, in the enormous accumulation of wealth in this area over the last 10 years and everything it's done to affordability in the area. It is a major issue for the Bay Area generally that it's almost unaffordable to live here. And so that means in a lot of service positions and a lot of lower paid professions, it's becoming very difficult to stay here. So in our narrow world, our JCCs have a hard time retaining people. Our schools have a hard time hiring educators, and we're struggling with that. So one of the things we did nearly immediately, just reasoning that discretionary income is whether it's for rent or something else, is what's really at stake here. We worked with a donor to, at least as a pilot process, to pay back student loan debt for Jewish educators. So as long as they were in the field and supporting the field, there was going to be help in paying down the debt. The bigger issues, the macroeconomic issues that affect us, especially in the realm of real estate, we're still grappling with. But it's important that we do, because otherwise people will not be able to stay here. And then finally, to your question, and once they stay here, if we're not talking about professionals anymore, but access points, to your point, again, it's part of why we've adjusted our model to be more strategic in the grant making we do, because many of those grants go to organizations that don't charge for their for many of their events, and we want to be able to open those doors wider for those organizations as portals for people to join.
It makes me wonder how the Jewish community of the Bay Area could sort of be a laboratory and sort of be put into the service of Judaism nationally and across the world, right? That potentially a lot more of the world has an interest in what goes on Jewishly in the Bay Area than the Bay Area alone. And, maybe in a strange sense, it's similar to how a lot of Jews have a stake in what happens in Israel, that it's gonna have an impact beyond that place. And I'm curious whether you as a federation or just sort of you as a citizen of that area, has thoughts, has conversations about those kinds of questions, and whether there are, when you think about who some of the great funders of major Jewish initiatives of the last century, that they came from industries like, the banking industry or something like that, that might have been in New York. But now it seems like the wealth that might be out there to create some of these things is in your neck of the woods. And I'm just sort of curious how we think about a shift of that nature.
Well, you're right in describing what's going on here. The incredible accumulation of wealth, including for the purpose of this conversation, in the hands of Jewish people, members of our community. There are some, I think, who think San Francisco is just an N. This area is just an N of one, and it's like, what's the point? Because it's so strange and it's such an outlier. But I think if you look at the trends we've talked about in this conversation, take intergroup marriage, for example, I guarantee you, the discussion of Jews of color, those are not, we are not alone. So
right.
In this area, Dan, I would love to say I'm going to say I'm cautiously optimistic on our ability to blaze a path that others can follow. And the reason I have caution is because the people who are here are different. That's why they came here. 70% of our community was not born here. So they're mostly coming in, many of them for those tech opportunities, many of them to disrupt, many of them to get away from old legacy structures that they didn't want to be involved in, or the community they didn't want to be involved in, or the faith that they wanted to shed. And so it presents enormous challenges. But I'm optimistic. That's the caution. That's the cautiously part of my cautiously optimistic. My optimistic part of that is that we've got something incredible to offer, really incredibly that those people express a need for. And if we can get out of our own way and stop talking about, survival and continuity and that sort of thing, and which I understand, I get why we did and why we still do sometimes. But if we can just talk about the value of the gift of Jewish life and the way it can enhance a life of meaning and support a community, then I think we got something great.
One thing that I'm aware of that goes on in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that I think the Federation has really been the driver on, is the amplification of the Wexner Heritage Program in the San Francisco Bay Area. That, for our listeners, this is a program that's about sort of, that was originally founded by the Wexner Foundation, that was about helping Jewish lay leaders learn more about Judaism, learn more Jewish content and a wide variety of Jewish content so that they could become better, more visionary leaders. And most cities in America have this kind of come around. It's paid for, I think, mostly by the foundation, and it comes around to a particular city once every so many years. And so you have a small group of folks every 5, 10, I don't know how many years that sort of have been part of this program. And I think it is, in many cases, a lot and enough to do something interesting. But in your area, you have it every single year, I believe. And that is a partnership between the Federation and the Wexner Foundation. And I think that that's sort of a really interesting example of a strategic use of a resource that might have been invented by someone else, that might have been available, but to say, hey, can we sort of partner with this to really bring it to our city and to really make something happen and to put a critical mass into place? So I'm wondering if you can sort of tell us a little bit more about that program and its impact in your area, but also to think about, is that instructive in terms of other possibilities that are out there, not necessarily specific ones, but, as you think about ways to sort of try to experiment with some of this stuff, does that sort of shine a light on possibilities?
We looked at this program and we said, look, this is one of the best things the Jewish community is offering. And why should we wait every 10 or 20 years if we can find the funding and muster the support to bring it here on an ongoing basis? And that's what we've done. I was in the first Wexner class that came to San Francisco. And if you didn't pick it up before, there's no way I would be in this role had I not been in the Wexner class. And I can't tell you how many people have had their lives and their trajectories changed by that program, because for the purpose of the listeners, it's an intense program. It's 2 years. It's every other week. It's 4 hours. It's trips to Israel and the mountaintops in Colorado. And it's transformative. It's at a very high educational level. I think as an example of how the Federation has really moved the needle in the community in collaboration with the Wexner Foundation, you're absolutely right. We certainly, at least in this Federation, we don't need to own it. We don't need to create it. There's lots of opportunities for partnership, which is, can be difficult. Let's keep it real for a minute. Can sometimes be difficult to broker because, whose name hangs on the mantle, right, could be important if you're trying to get visibility and relevance.
So I'm flashing back to a conversation we had with your colleague, with your right down the road, with Zach Bodner from the Oshman Family JCC. And I mean, we've had a few conversations with him. And what I'm thinking of in particular is that we really delved deep into sort of the question of representation. And in that context, we were talking about like the title was Jewish ? Community ? Center. To what extent is a Jew living in X area being represented, being vocalized by the voices of certain Jewish institutions? And so I kind of wanted to flip that question to you, because I think one of the most contentious issues in Jewish life right now, we think it's Israel, we think it's intermarriage, we think it's all of these content issues. I actually think it's a structure issue. I actually think that there's a huge tension between how certain people understand representation, with some thinking that really there are certain institutions whose purpose is to speak for the Jewish population of whether it's a region or a city or a country. There are certain organizations that exist to do that, and who, when they speak, are speaking for like the Jewish community, for lack of a better term, and to use a term that we've criticized over and over again. And then there are other people that think, you know what, maybe actually there isn't any one institution that's the voice of Jewish life or of a Jewish population. And I always like to ask this question of folks in different federations, because I think the responses are very different. I don't think people are all on the same page here, and I think that it unlocks a lot of important conversations. So I guess all this is to say, is your Jewish Federation, do you conceptualize it as the voice of the counties that are part of your area? Is it a voice, or is it neither?
When I think about our role as federation, I think about us as a leading voice, not the voice and not a voice, but a leading voice. And that's by virtue of the number of stakeholders that we have as part of this federation. It connotes that we're not by no means the only voice. The Jewish Community Relations Council, which we largely fund and which engages in public affairs and interaction with civic officials, talks about the voice of the organized Jewish community. I think their reasoning is that...
It's good because I'm very disorganized, so I know that it's not me.
Well, then the lines were drawn really accurately, I guess. I don't know, clearly. But I think it's, I think it's an interesting... I think it's an interesting notion that you have your hand on. I don't think there are any easy solutions to it other than to have the humility to understand that A, this is not a community, which is why we talk about communities, but B, to have the audacity to think that we have some leadership role, not the only leadership role, but some leadership role in terms of our community.
I guess I'm just wondering, as we close, are there any other pieces that you've grown to learn from this community study, or just from your time these 3 years as Federation head, that you would want to leave folks around the country with, whether they are, institutional leaders of Jewish life, or if they're just people?
Let me leave this thought, courtesy of Rabbi Ed Feinstein, Temple Valley, Judea. So when I stepped into this role, I don't think I was so much aware of the point in history that we are as I am now. And by that point in history, and again, courtesy of him, thinking about a role in which I am daily balancing two generations, a generation which experienced the greatest triumph in Jewish modernity and the creation of the State of Israel, and the greatest tragedy in the Shoah, the Holocaust, and a generation that has a faint idea of both of those at best. And the insight that I assigned to him is that, in antiquity, those great calamities, from the entering the land of Israel to the destruction of the Second Temple, were separated by hundreds of years and many generations. We're talking about grandparents and their grandchildren. I become acutely aware of that, and I experience the effect of it almost on a daily basis, whether I'm talking to a 90-year-old who's reminding me of her experience in the war, or I'm talking to a 22-year-old who just came back from birthright in Israel. It's profoundly affecting for me. And again, I feel blessed for the opportunity to try and work with it.
Thank you so much, Danny Grossman, for joining us.
Thanks. Great pleasure. Anytime, you guys.
And thanks also to all of you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you will tune into more of these episodes looking back 5 years after the Pew study. We want to close out this episode as we always do by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to Twitter and find us at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last plug we like to make is that we greatly appreciate any financial donation you are able to allot for us, and you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.